Hello, I'm Ben Wattenberg. A constitutional amendment to balance the budget is a key item in the Republican contract with America. The House of Representatives recently passed it. Now the debate moves to the Senate. But do we really need to change the U.S. Constitution to get our books in order? How important is a balanced budget? And is there a political agenda behind the debate? Joining us to sort through the conflict and the consensus are four leading economists from San Francisco via satellite: Milton Friedman, Nobel laureate in economics and senior research fellow at the Hoover Institution; Herbert Stein, chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors under Presidents Nixon and Ford, and a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute; James Miller, budget director for President Reagan; and John M. Olin, distinguished fellow at the Center for the Study of Public Choice at George Mason University; and Henry Aaron, director of economic studies at the Brookings Institution and a former chairman of the Advisory Council on Social Security. The topic before this House, the Budget Balancing Act, this week on Think Tank. One of the most common stories in the economic profession concerned President Truman, who, after hearing so many economists tell him on the one hand this and on the other hand that, turned to his staff and growled, "Find me a one-armed economist." And they're probably still out looking. In the 1980s, the federal deficit went way up and stayed up. According to the budget just introduced by the Clinton administration, in 1995, the government will spend $193 billion more than it will take in, and the deficit will continue at about that level into the future. Moreover, critics say Congress won't stop this trend because Congress is out of control. House Republicans say the best way to rein in spending is to pass a constitutional amendment that will force Congress to balance the budget by the year 2002. What they're saying is, stop me before I kill again. But is the deficit really so bad? For the nation as a whole, the deficit as a share of our gross domestic product is heading down. So, on the one hand, things don't look so bad. In fact, some Democrats say that the crusade for a balanced budget amendment is really just a smokescreen for a conservative ideology that wants to strangle government by cutting off its oxygen, that is, its ability to spend. But on the other hand, look at this. The Bipartisan Commission on Entitlement and Tax Reform projects that unless changes are made, the deficit will soar to 19% of our gross domestic product by the year 2030, and that would be a handful. Milton Friedman in San Francisco via satellite. Do we need a balanced budget amendment?
We need a strong balanced budget amendment, such as was proposed in the Contract for America, with a tough tax limitation provision. We do not need the kind of weak balanced budget amendment that was actually passed by the Congress.
Okay, Herb Stein?
Well, I think you're going to find that you need some two-handed economists here, because I don't think we need a balanced budget amendment either. I don't think we need a balanced budget amendment of either kind. I think our record, except for a brief spree during the Reagan period, was not so bad. I think we are learning to do better, and I think that we will do better without the amendment than with it.
Henry Aaron?
I think we need to balance the budget. I think we can balance the budget, in fact, by the year 2002. But I think a balanced budget amendment will do absolutely nothing to help us along the way, and will, in short order, be the source of incentives for gimmickry. It will bring the courts into budget policy in a way that I think everybody should deplore. And in short, I think the balanced budget amendment will stand in our way rather than help us on the road to sound budget policy.
Jim Miller.
I disagree with all three of my colleagues here.
Surprise.
I think we need a balanced budget amendment, though I would support the one that Milton was talking about. I don't think we ought to cast this one away. I think it would have some good effects. Some research that I've done with Mark Crane suggests that. On the other hand, I think it would have an effect. It's not that it would just be gimmickry. I think the result would be that it would put discipline on members of Congress, the sort of discipline that they sorely need.
But
Well,
go ahead.
Well, it kind of assumes that this discipline will be in the direction of getting us a better budget policy. Now, there's no reason to think that the best of all budget policies is to balance the budget every year or every decade or every generation. We're not going to have the best of all budget policies anyway, with or without the amendment. The question is whether, without the amendment, we will have a chance of coming closer. And I think we will, because the economy fluctuates, cyclically, demography changes, other requirements change, and the balanced budget amendment is going to prevent us from making rational adaptations to these changes in the economy.
I don't believe that's correct. The amendment as it was originally proposed did not rule out temporary deficits or surpluses. It did not require a balanced budget every year. The issue, however, is not being, it seems to me, presented correctly. The key issue is not balancing the budget. The key issue is how do you keep spending from growing at an intolerable rate? As of today, governments, federal, state, and local, spend about 43% of the national income. We're not getting our money's worth. And the trouble with a weak balanced budget amendment, which is why I am against it, is that it will tend to drive Congress. It will have discipline, as Jim says, but will tend to exert that discipline in the way of higher taxes rather than lower spending.
If that's what you believe, Milton, then I think you should make your case to the American public and try and win it in a straight-up fight in a democratic system, not shackle the budgetary process with rules that are really not made for the next year or the next 5 years, but for decades.
Henry, let me ask you this. We have rarely had an election, certainly in a congressional year, where the issues were at least allegedly nationalized. Now, Gingrich went around with that contract for America, and he said, this is what we're voting on.
Oh, but
and well, wait a minute. That's what he said. I know there's a lot of fuzz in there, but he
30% of the public had never heard of the contract, and most of those who had heard of it didn't know what it said.
But this is
so it's not that wasn't even an example of a nationalization. Let me say the reason I think good conservatives should be really upset at the prospect of a balanced budget amendment, as many conservatives are, such as Robert Bork, the editorial board of the Wall Street Journal, is that if we enact such an amendment, it is going to threaten, I think, one of the great strengths of the American economy that conservatives would correctly pride. Compared to European nations, we have less government spending, we are less bureaucratic, we have fewer regulations. It may be the case that we are in the midst of a conservative era currently. In a few years, there may be a more activist mood in Congress. What would be the easiest thing in the world to do? Well, mandate that private business do the things that government now spends. Pay unemployment insurance benefits, pay retirement benefits, provide sickness benefits. One could, in other words, replace, because of the restrictions of a balanced budget amendment, the tendency when there is a consensus about public need for government to spend money and raise taxes with regulations and mandates.
Henry, we're talking about what good conservatives should believe. You certainly have credentials as a good conservative.
Right,
so,
but we're doing that already. That is to say that offloading to mandates on state and local governments and on the private sector. I mean, Milton's point about 43%. If you add regulation in there, Milton, you get more like 50%.
But
It's
more over
exactly wrong.
50%.
We're at 34% according to the OECD.
No, but
let Milton come in from San Francisco for a minute. Milton.
I think that much of this is beside the point. In the first place, so far as the public at large voting on it, I'm making my case in the public, the balanced budget amendment will only become part of the Constitution if it's accepted by 3/4 of the states. That's surely a chance for the public to express their opinion on it. We're not trying to slip anything over. In the second place, I want to emphasize that I'm not a conservative. I'm a liberal in the good old-fashioned sense of a 19th century liberal, more likely a libertarian. And as such, what I want to do, and what I believe the public at large wants to do, is to, in Reagan's phrase, get the government off the back of the people. And the only way you can do that is by having some kind of a limit on government spending. That's the purpose
could I say,
of
I think-
requiring a 60% majority for a tax measure.
I think Milton is exactly right. One important, and if not the most important effect of balanced budget amendment would be to circumscribe the growth of government. Mark Crane and I did some analysis of state regulatory institutions. Some states have balanced budget requirements in the Constitution. Some have it as a matter of law. Some do not have it. There are all sorts of different variations. We used as the dependent variable growth of per capita spending in the state. What we found, Milton, and Herbert and Henry, is that a balanced budget requirement restrains the growth of spending in the states. And this happens without regard to whether there is a supermajority requirement for a tax increase.
But the public and the political process are going to have to make a lot of very difficult decisions about the budget, decisions about the budget that are as important as the total size of the budget or the size of the deficit. They have to decide what is appropriate defense policy, what is appropriate welfare policy, what is appropriate health policy. And these questions cannot be resolved by a constitutional amendment, and they are no different from the question about the total size of the budget.
I believe they are very different.
Balanced budget
Hold on
amendment
one
wouldn't
second.
enforce.
I want to just shift gears for a moment to help our audience out. Let me put this question in the pot. Are deficits really bad? Running deficits year after year after year?
Well, I don't think you can answer that question because it depends on what you're doing with the money that you raised through the deficit. And of course, it's kind of other things equal. I think little deficits are little bad and big deficits are big bad, but there are certainly circumstances for which it is entirely appropriate to run a deficit.
Herb is right. I mean, it's in a perfect world, you would run surpluses sometimes, you would run deficits sometimes. Herb invented the full employment surplus or balanced budget full employment with the automatic stabilizers, and all of that works. The question, though, is we're not in a perfect world. Would it make sense to prevent the politicians in Washington from using deficit finance? And I think the answer is yes.
We just elected your kind of people. We elected a Jim Miller, Milton Friedman kind of Congress, and you don't trust them?
I don't trust them.
Well, look at what's happening.
Hold it. You ran for Senate in the primary in Virginia against Oliver North. You almost beat him.
Right.
Would you trust you if you were there?
Of course I would trust me.
But you don't trust your Republican conservative colleagues?
I would trust them too.
I don't trust the institution.
But I think we ought to have a surplus now. But when I ask myself, should we have a surplus now, I say, yes, it would be desirable, and it would be desirable because I can think of $300 or $400 billion worth of spending that's in the budget that I would be willing to get rid of in order to have the surplus. I would get rid of Medicare. I would cut Medicaid down very sharply. I would start phasing out Social Security. I would get rid of farm price supports. I would get rid of the Small Business Administration.
And you won't get elected.
Jim, you want to run on that platform? You're a conservative here.
I want to make a lot of changes. Maybe not all the changes.
Well, look, let's stop that. If you go after each one of those individually, you will not get elected.
Right.
If you go after them as a bundle, that's a different thing. I believe the views of the American public tend to be misunderstood. If you ask the public, do you want to cut Social Security, they'll say no. But if you ask them, would you rather eliminate the deficit by cutting spending or by increasing taxes, they overwhelmingly say they want to cut spending.
We've asked them now, since 1936, we've been asking them in public opinion polls, do you want to balance the budget? They always say overwhelmingly no, and they always overwhelmingly elect people who never did balance the budget and gave no sign of ever wanting to balance the budget. I don't think the American people really care very much about the balanced budget.
Hold on. We have...
Could I interject one point?
Yeah, go ahead.
We may not have balanced the budget to the nickel. From 1945 until 1974, the ratio of the U.S. debt to our productive capacity declined by more than half.
That was the year I left the government.
That was the year Herb left the government. It was because we were running deficits that were much smaller than the growth of the economy. If the deficits had been large, it would have grown. Now what happened was it then leveled off until 1981. These are facts, Milton.
I know.
And then in 1981, we entered an era where we cut taxes, raised spending, and really lied to the American public about the probable fiscal consequences
Milton.
of it.
The debt declined as a fraction of income, not because we ran small surpluses, small deficits, but because we inflated the debt away. We repudiated a large fraction of the debt. We were paying interest rates on the debt, which was below the rate of inflation. That's how the debt was reduced.
All right, let me talk about something that maybe I know something about, which is public opinion, which you all, learned economists, have discussed, and politics. I've been around Washington long enough to say, you know, what is the hidden agenda? And it's not even very hidden in this discussion. Milton Friedman says he doesn't care if the budget is balanced. He doesn't like government. He says the government is picking your pocket. So why are you arguing? I mean, isn't this being somewhat deceitful? Is to say, oh, we're talking, it's good for the economy, it's good for this, it's good for that. In fact, why don't you get out there and say government is bad for us, and this is what we're talking about, not a balanced budget amendment. This is a political agenda.
Well, look, I mean, you have too much government. I think that's what the election was about. Balancing the budget is very appealing to people. It will have the effect, as Milton said, of restraining the avarice of the federal government, and I think that's good.
I thought Herb was saying that you can use the balanced budget amendment, or Henry, to go up.
I don't think that's correct.
But I think the answer is, to your question, is that we have a responsibility to tell the American people what their choices are. And if we think that the government, I believe to say the government is too big by itself is really meaningless without specifying what the government is doing. And I think we should confront the American people with this choice. Do you want Medicare? Do you want Social Security? Do you want this or that?
All right, Milton, he says it doesn't matter the level of government. What do you say?
I'm saying, Herb, what you're saying is not fair. Those of us who think government has been doing too much have specified over and over again what we think needs to be done. Have over and over again urged, for example, privatization of Social Security. So that it's not fair to criticize us on the ground that we have.
But I'm just criticizing all these people in the Congress who have never said anything like that.
Well, that may well be.
I think it's also important, you mentioned public opinion, Ben.
I mentioned it because you all mentioned it.
Yes,
right.
well, okay. The American public has consistently said they want lower taxes and a balanced budget. They have also said, when asked about specific activities of government, that they want to maintain or even expand everything that they're asked specifically about, with two exceptions, welfare and foreign aid.
Right, so public opinion in this field is mush.
It's inconsistent.
It's much. It's
not.
It's inconsistent.
Milton,
the questions that are asked, because the questions that are asked.
They say two things.
No, excuse me for a moment. If you ask a person, do you want to eliminate one thing which he benefits from, the rational answer is no. But if you give him a package, if you give him a bundle, and say, do you want, the only way we can cut government is by cutting a lot of things. We had that example in connection with the closing of the military bases. You couldn't get any one closed when you tried to get it alone. When you had a package of it, a la Dick Armey's proposal, you got bases closed.
Let me ask you this, Henry. I mean, I just asked the conservatives, Jim Miller and Milton Friedman, whether
I'm not a conservative.
I'm sorry, the conservative and libertarian faction of this panel, whether they weren't really promoting a not-so-hidden agenda. They weren't just talking about the budget amendment, but they were talking about they would like to defund the welfare state. And this is one way to do it. And my sense is that the politics on the other side, you were all talking about, well, it would be hard to adjust it and hard to regulate it, and sometime we ought to have deficits. But you guys want to keep the welfare state, and you have to have high spending to do it. No, is that the political agenda over there?
Well, it's not the case of, it's not my case. Of course, the welfare state is a very vague term, and I would like to confine welfare to a very small fraction of the American population that is really poor, and get rid of all the welfare that goes to the American middle class, for about which everybody is now bleeding. So I'm not for the welfare state in that general sense, but my agenda, I guess, really is to have a rational national discussion about what our alternatives are in the open, and to offer the American, and I think that we are capable of learning to do better. And I would give the example of last year's debate about health care reform. I think that was a case in which the options were fairly clearly laid out, and in which we did not make the same mistakes that we made 20 or 30 years earlier about making enormous commitments to the future. I think we are showing a great gain in the prudence and responsibility of our fiscal policy, and I think so. I'm hopeful that we will continue to do that.
But Herbert and Henry, I think that a balanced budget amendment would force people to make those kinds of choices. Our politicians, as representatives of the people, would have to weigh and assess the alternatives rather than offloading the burden on future generations because of fiscal illusion.
Yeah, actually, a balanced budget amendment doesn't force any member of Congress to vote against any public expenditure or in favor of any tax.
But it forces them to discuss it and resolve it in some way.
It doesn't even do that. They can, if they wish, ignore the amendment. And if they do so, you will have a situation where somebody will take it to court, and the Supreme Court will be setting budget policy for the United States.
Not under current circumstances.
That's the only way
anyone that spends beyond the limit is in violation of federal law.
Oh, absolutely.
It's violation of the anti-deficiency law, and they go to jail.
Oh,
who is that? Who is that?
Members of Congress or an agency head that authorizes spending beyond the limit.
I can see on the monitor that Milton wants to come in from the
Yes,
West
you're
Coast.
right. I do not believe it will go to the courts. I believe that a properly drawn-out balanced budget amendment will put the power in the hands of the Congress and the President between them, and that you're not going to have all of this nonsense that's being talked about. What I don't understand, I want to ask those who are opposed to the balanced budget amendment, whether they think it's inappropriate for the public at large to set a limit on the fraction of their income that government is entitled to spend.
Absolutely not. I think it is entirely proper. We have an electoral process that is perfectly suited to do that now.
It is not. It is suited to do it on a piecemeal basis, but not on an overall basis.
The question is whether it's appropriate for the people of 1995 to decide for the people of 2095 what proportion of their income should go to the government, and I don't think that's appropriate. We're talking about forever now if we talk about a constitutional amendment, and that I think is what this...
Would you think it would be wrong for the people in 1995 to specify that that governments at all levels should never spend 100% of the national income?
Henry?
I would just point out that Milton is once again discussing something that is not before the American public. What is before the American public is an amendment he himself has said is not well designed and that he himself would oppose. He's discussing a different agenda, not the one that is before the American public today, which is the amendment that the House of Representatives approved.
Go ahead, Milton.
That isn't so, because the Senate still has to come in. And in my opinion, I'm opposed to the present one because I think if you turn this down, there will be enough of an outcry about turning it down because of the tax limitation proposal that within 2 or 3 or 4 months you'd have a proper balanced budget amendment passed. I do not think the public at large is opposed to a 60% majority rule for taxes.
I don't think they are either. But on the other hand, I don't think that you're going to get the 2/3 vote in both houses that you have to put the amendment before the states with the tax limitation in it. I wish that were not the case. I would like to even strengthen the amendment further by putting a restraint on the proportion of gross national product the government may spend. But that wish is not going to come to fruition, I'm afraid.
Just to go back to the point that Herb made, my colleague Charles Schultz has pointed out that the Founding Fathers, when dealing with matters of human rights, stated them with great specificity, put them in the Constitution, and defined them exactly. In discussing the procedures that would be used inside the government, they laid down hard and fast rules. But when it came to setting economic policy, such as the share of gross domestic product that should go to government, they said nothing. They understood that these are the kinds of issues that need to be resolved in each generation through the political process by elected officials. I don't think we would want Thomas Jefferson setting an economic policy for our age. We would not want Alexander Hamilton setting policy.
Could I just say, first of all, never in their wildest dreams would they think of a government as large as we have today. And secondly, Mr. Jefferson, before he died, wrote a friend and said he thought perhaps the biggest mistake in the Constitution was allowing deficit finance.
Okay, thank you, Milton Friedman, Herb Stein, Jim Miller, and Henry Aaron. And thank you. Please send your comments and questions to New River Media, 1150 17th Street Northwest, Washington, D.C. 20036, or we can be reached via email at thinktv@aol.com. For Think Tank, I'm Ben Wattenberg.
This has been a production of BJW Incorporated in association with New River Media, which are solely responsible for its content.